librarian at the Cuyahoga Falls Library. This fall, we started a really cool cooking and book club called Read 'em and Eat. Now, our first book for this book club was Mercy Watson, and some of you might know Mercy Watson has a favorite food. Any of you remember what that is? That's right, buttered toast. So for our first cooking video to go along with our book, we thought it might be fun to try making some bread. Now, I have a disclaimer for you all. I am by no means a bread making expert, so we've picked a really simple recipe to get started in the hopes that everyone will be able to follow along and hopefully our bread will turn out to be delicious. Now, here are the things that you will need to make this very simple bread. You're going to need a nice big bowl and a spoon to do some stirring. You'll need flour, sugar, salt, and some lukewarm water. You'll need a measuring cup, half of a teaspoon and an eighth of a teaspoon, and you'll need some yeast. Now, the yeast you should have gotten at the library. We decided to go with instant yeast because it's a little bit easier to work with. You don't have to proof it in the water first and make sure it's still working. So this we can just mix right in with our dry ingredients. Now, if you are a novice baker like me, you might not know too much about yeast, and yeast is actually pretty cool. So yeast is actually alive. It's a single-celled organism that we use in baking in order to make things rise. So what yeast does, and it does this a few different ways, but the simplest explanation is that it eats sugars and converts that sugar into gases, into carbon dioxide. And that's how we get bubbles and things on the inside of bread. I'm sure you guys have sometimes had bread with big holes in the middle. That's due to yeast. So we are going to go ahead and get our packet open. Now, if you wanted to, you could use this whole packet and just double the recipe. I'm going to go ahead and recommend that just keep it to the proportions I'm giving you, just in case it doesn't work out, because then you've still got some yeast left to try again. All right, so I'm going to open that and just set it aside for now. And I'm going to start with our flour, okay? So we're going to take our measuring cup, and I always like to kind of fluff the flour up a little bit. We don't want to pack too much in there. So for this recipe, we are going to start with 2 3/4 cup of flour. And we'll be able to add a little bit more as we go on if that's necessary. So we're going to do 1 cup. Go ahead and dump that in your bowl. And then we'll fluff up our flour again. We're going to do cup number 2. Now, my measuring cup has a little line for 3/4, but you might find it easier to use a half of a cup or a fourth of a cup 3 times. So I'm just going to go back in and then make sure I don't have too much flour in there. You can do a little bit more. Okay, that looks pretty good. So now we've got the bulk of our flour in the bowl. We are going to put a little bit of sugar in. So we're going to do 1.5 teaspoons of sugar. So this not only gives the bread kind of a nice sweet flavor, but it also gives the yeast something to eat. So go ahead and we'll do 3 tablespoons. Very good. And then we're going to do the same thing with salt. We're going to use 1.5 teaspoons of salt. Okay. So 1/2, 1, 1.5. All right. So now we've got our sugar, our salt, and our flour. We're going to go ahead and put our yeast in. All right, now for this yeast, we want to add about half of this packet, which should work out to be about 1 1/8 teaspoons of yeast. So I have my half teaspoon here. I'm going to go in twice. So there's 1, 2, and then I'm going to take my itty bitty little 1/8 teaspoon and put that in as well. Okay, now for your remaining yeast, you should be able to just fold it up, put a clip, and save it for later. So we'll put that off to the side. Now you do want to go ahead and stir these dry ingredients together, just so they're fairly evenly distributed throughout the bowl. All right. Now comes the slightly messy part. We are going to take our lukewarm water. So we're going to use just a cup of it. And when I say lukewarm, you want it to be, not too much warmer than room temperature. If the water is too hot, it's going to kill the yeast, and then the yeast can't do the work that you want it to. So this is just very slightly warm to the touch. If you have like a meat thermometer or a candy thermometer, you can even take the temperature of this. Just make sure it's not getting above 110 degrees. Okay, but touch should be fine too. So we're going to slowly pour some of this in and start stirring. And it's going to start to get pretty sticky. But that is one of the things that makes bread making fun, is you get to get your hands a little bit messy and you get something delicious at the end of it. Okay, so I know you probably can't see great, but my dough is starting to come together a little bit. I'm going to put the rest of the water in. And make sure you're scraping the sides. Okay. So yes, we are just going to keep stirring this until most of that loose flour is incorporated. And then, this is the fun sticky part, you're going to start squeezing this a little with your hands. Just do it right in the bowl. And you see how it's coming together to form a dough ball? Now, the reason that I wanted to check to see if I needed more water was that it was looking pretty shaggy. It looked like it wasn't going to come together very well. But as I'm stirring this and kneading this, it's actually formed a really good ball, okay? So I'm just going to briefly set this off to the side. I'm going to take my flour and very lightly sprinkle a little bit of flour on the surface that I'm going to use to knead the bread. Now, kneading is, if you ask me, the really fun part of bread making. Okay, so I'm using, it's something called a slip mat. It's a nice surface that's not going to slide around on my table. My table has some lines in it, and that would not be a good fit for kneading bread. If you have a flat table, that would be fine to use to knead your bread. If you've got a countertop, you could also maybe tape down some parchment paper, although that might get a little slippy slidey. So if you check with your grown-up, they've probably got some good ideas on where you could do your kneading. So I'm going to take my ball of dough and put it on my mat. And this is where we just want to make sure we're getting it into a ball. So that's coming together really nicely. It's a little sticky. It's definitely grabbing at my fingers a bit, and that's okay. If it starts to get too sticky, we can add a little bit more flour, but we don't want to add too much flour because that'll make a really dense, hard dough. So now when I say kneading, Do any of you guys know what kneading is? It's actually a way to develop something called gluten in bread. So a really simple definition is that gluten are these long chains that form within the bread to give it some structure. So a good way to start kneading is you kind of put your dough in the middle here, and then you fold it back towards you and then press it with the palm of your hand. Then you turn it 90 degrees, fold it back, and press it, okay? And you're going to keep doing that. Fold back and press, turn. Fold back and press, turn. Fold back and press, turn. Okay, and you can start to get a little quicker as you go. Now, again, it's probably hard for you to see, but this is getting a lot stickier as we go. So that's a good sign that everything is getting incorporated the way that it should be. Now, we are actually going to knead this dough for, let's say probably 5 or 6 minutes to start. All right, so baking bread actually ends up being a pretty good workout. So I'm going to keep kneading here. I'm probably going to fast forward through this next part of the video so that you don't have to just stand here watching me knead my bread. And then we will check back in once we've done that first knead. All right, so that's some pretty good progress for now. I'm just going to let this sit here and rest a moment. And while that's resting for a second, we're actually going to go rinse out our bowl because we're going to use this to let the dough rise. All right, so I'll be right back. All right, so while I stepped away, I got my bowl nice and clean and dry. I also grabbed some plastic wrap, and I very briefly turned my oven on at 200 degrees for like a minute. I didn't even let it preheat all the way. I just wanted to get it a little bit warm inside, and then I turned it off. And I will explain why in a moment. So the first thing that we're going to do is try to open this bottle of vegetable oil. Then we're going to take a paper towel and just get a little bit of oil on it, and we're going to use that to grease the inside of our bowl. Because we're going to put our very sticky dough in here, and we just don't want it to get stuck to the sides. We want it to be nice and slippery. You really don't need very much. So we'll put that aside. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and knead this for a couple more minutes. And something that if you have ever watched The Great British Bake Off, you have probably heard them talk about the window pane test. So the window pane test is where you take a piece of your dough and you try and stretch it really thin. And if you can stretch it so thin that you can see through it to a light source, that's the window pane test. Now, I'm not sure how well you can see. I'm trying. But my dough is not quite there. Do you see how it breaks apart? That means the gluten isn't developed enough. It's not quite stretchy enough. So we're going to do some more kneading. All right? All right. Well, I think that's pretty close. So now we're just going to make sure our dough is making a nice little ball. and we are going to put it in our greased bowl. And this should rise, and it should rise enough to probably double in size, which is why we need to make sure it's in a pretty big bowl. So we'll put it in our lightly oiled bowl, and then we're going to take some saran wrap and place it over top. Now, if your house is pretty warm, you could just leave this out at room temperature, and that should be enough to let it rise. Or, like I said, I had done, if you want to make your oven just a little bit warm, you don't want it to be hot, but have your grown-up go turn the oven on just for a moment, just to trap some heat inside, turn it off, and let it sit for a few minutes. And then you can slide your dough in your nice warm oven to help it proof. Now, the hard work is over. I don't know about you guys, but I definitely need to rest my arms for a little. So the hard part is over, but now the waiting begins, because we're going to let this sit and rise for 1 to 2 hours, okay? So while this is rising, you can get your area all cleaned up, get everything put away. I would leave your mat out, because we're going to do just a little bit more kneading and shaping when it comes out of the bowl, all right? But go ahead, set a timer for an hour, and then check on it, and if it's risen enough, you can move on to the next step. If you think it needs a little bit more time to get a little bit bigger, you can leave it in there for up to 2 hours. All right, everybody, I have waited about 1 hour and 40 minutes, and I've checked back in on my dough, and it definitely looks like it's risen quite a bit. So we can go ahead and take this plastic wrap off. Now, we're going to get back to our dough in a second, but in the meantime, you want to make sure that you have a baking sheet. And I have some parchment paper, so I went ahead and put some parchment paper down just to keep the bread from sticking. You're going to need that vegetable oil again, and a little bit of plastic wrap. So, we have our dough. It's definitely looking a little bit more risen than it did before. And our next step is to very gently deflate it. So, sometimes this is referred to as punching down the dough. You don't really want to punch. You don't want to knock all the air out of it, but we're just going to knock it down a little to give it room to rise again. So I'm going to put my plastic wrap over here. So you're going to take your fist and just very gently press down into the dough, okay? So you can see here, I've just pressed into it a bit, and then we're going to gently turn it out. Whoop, mine's looking like I maybe didn't have the bottom greased quite enough. It's a little sticky. Okay. So now we have our dough out of the bowl, and we're going to just turn it into a nice little oval loaf. All right? So we don't really want to go back to kneading it or anything. Not at this point. Some bread recipes you do knead again, but for this one, we're just going to shape it in to a nice little oval loaf. All right, so it'll look like that. We're going to lay it down on our parchment paper, and now we're going to do a second rise. I know, bread definitely takes some patience. So we're going to take our piece of saran wrap, and just like we did with the bowl, we're going to put a little bit of oil on a paper towel and give it a sec to let it kind of soak in there. And then just very lightly brush this over the plastic. And that's just to make sure it doesn't stick too badly to the bread. Okay? So, you know what, I'm going to put a little bit more on, just since I think I was too restrained with the with the bowl. So I'm gonna add just a little bit more, and then gently lay our plastic wrap on top of our bread, you can see here. And then we're going to leave that out for another probably 45 minutes, okay? So when we come back from this rise, it'll be time to do the baking, which is the really exciting part. In the meantime, you can get all the rest of your stuff cleaned up, and you know, as a librarian, I've got to recommend you grab a book for the next 45 minutes and do some reading while you're waiting for our next step. Okay everyone, we are almost ready to put our loaves of bread in the oven. When you come back after that second rise, your loaf of bread should look a little bit puffy. If it's not really looking too puffy, you might want to leave it just a little bit longer, but as you can see here, mine has risen just a bit, so I definitely think we can go ahead with getting it baked. So we're going to remove the plastic wrap, and then we are going to fill another glass with some lukewarm water. Again, shouldn't be hot to the touch, just slightly above room temperature. And I have a handy dandy little brush here, and we're going to use that to brush some water on top of our bread. And according to the recipe I read, this should help with the rise. If you don't have one of these brushes, I would think that you could dab this on with a paper towel, maybe even just sprinkle a bit on and then smooth it very carefully with your hand. And then we need to give the bread some space to expand. So you're going to take a sharp knife. I would check with your grown-up. They might want to do this part themselves. I'm going to tilt this down, and we're just going to make 3 score marks across the top of our bread. Okay, so you can take the knife, whoop, I'm sliding a little, and just make 3 quick cuts. And if it looks like it didn't go through far enough, you can kind of go back and have that, but they don't need to be deep, just across the top. So you can see here I've got my 3 score marks. Now we have our oven preheated to 425, and I am going to go ahead and slide this guy in the middle rack, and we will set our timer for, oh, I need to double check what the timing was. We're going to bake the bread for 35 to 40 minutes. So go ahead and set your timer, I would say probably for 30. And then you can always come back and check and add a little bit more time if you need to. Okay, so I've got my cooling rack on the table. I'm just going to take a spatula and lay my bread down. Now, I definitely think this is a bread that's fairly, you know what, let me go put this hot sheet back on the oven. Okay. I do think this is a bread that is a little bit more dense. It's a very, very basic bread. I think the recipe calls it hearty or something like that. So it might not be quite as light and fluffy as you're used to, but hopefully it's going to be pretty tasty. So we're going to let this sit a little bit, and hopefully you guys had some very successful bakes yourselves. Just one quick reminder for all of you. Even when you are using a very simple bread recipe, there are still lots of things that can go wrong. Temperature, humidity, length of time, and all of those different steps, they all play a role in how your bread turns out. So I'm going to give you a little peek at my loaf, which did not quite turn out the way I was hoping it would. It's not bad. It's got a very crusty outside. The inside, you can see, is pretty dense. It didn't really get a lot of that rise and those bubbles that I was hoping for. It still tastes okay, but it's definitely a recipe that I think I would maybe try again on a different day. So please don't be disappointed if your bread doesn't quite turn out the way that you wanted to. Like I said, there are lots of factors that go into making a good loaf of bread. And it's one of those things, the more that you practice, the better your bread is going to be. All right, so I hope you guys had fun at least getting started making a loaf of bread and seeing how it turned out. And I will see you on Monday, I believe it's the 19th, for our book club. All right, you can tell me all about how your baking experience went. I can't wait.